Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here are your co-hosts, Doug Lesmerises and Shahan Jeharaja. And we're back on the College Football Survivor Show. No Shahan this week. He's off. So we have good friend of the pod, Mike Rodak of AL.com, here to talk about the Alabama spring game. We're going to touch on the LSU spring game a little bit later. We're going to touch on some Bama culture stuff later. But we really want to dedicate, Mike, this edition of the podcast as we run through all the best teams from spring. Bama's Bama. Bama is so defining. And even when they're not the national champs, it feels like so much of the sport revolves around where Bama is. And is Bama on top? Is Bama climbing? Is Bama mad? Saban's Bama is Bama. So I want to devote a big chunk of this pod to Alabama. And we're going to start off by talking about the quarterbacks. So I have a proposal later about the quarterbacks, but we'll start off with your thoughts on watching Alabama's spring game on Saturday. Ty Simpson, Jalen Milroe, 19 of 37 for 245. Ty Simpson, 12 of 26 for 155. Some drops in there. Saban right after the game was like, man, we had a bunch of drops. So stats don't tell the whole story. Overall, before we get into specifics of the competition, what did you think of the level of quarterback play? And they threw a couple freshmen out there too, 4 scholarship quarterbacks getting some run. Did you think the quarterbacks played well? Did you think they flashed? Did you think they were uneven? What did you think?
So this was the third spring game that I've covered since I've been on the beat, because I came in 2019 after that spring game. 2020 was canceled. So I've covered the last 3 spring games. And so I've seen Bryce Young in the last 2 spring games and then no Bryce Young in this spring game. And there's a difference when you're talking about likely number 1 overall pick and someone who's a Heisman Trophy winner and was top quarterback prospect in the country. We all know what Bryce Young can do. And there's a drop-off. There is an absolute drop-off from him to what we watched on Saturday. Even when you go back and I think look at Bryce in a spring game, which I don't think is the full Monty of Bryce. Like even last year, I don't think he had a spectacular spring game by any means, but I think it was still better than what we saw on Saturday. And that's not to say it was terrible. I think the biggest word, you even listen to the ESPN broadcast that came up and those guys talking to Saban and Tommy Rees, was just consistency, and just very inconsistent between the 2 quarterbacks, because there has been flashes, but overall the product is not consistent. There was too many mistakes, most notably Jalen Milroe's interception that he was backed up in the end zone, faced some pressure, just kind of heaved it up willy-nilly. The safety caught it like a center fielder and ran it back to the 1-yard line. Like that, I think, was the defining play of the game, because I think more than anything else, that's the play that's just going to irritate and eat away at Nick Saban. That sort of interception, that sort of mistake. So we didn't see that with Bryce. Like, that's not a mistake that Bryce really ever made, even when he was young and just kind of beginning. So that's the difference. And I do think there's been a drop-off in the quarterback play overall. What the reason for that is, they recruited. Tua was one of the best quarterbacks in the country. Bryce was one of the best quarterbacks in the country. Mac was not. Mac Jones was a 3-star kid who I think turned into something better. The recruiting has dropped off just a little at quarterback. Jalen Milroe came in when Bryce was already there. You might have a hard time getting a 5-star quarterback to come in when you already have Bryce Young. Ty Simpson, though, was borderline 5-star. He dropped off a little bit towards the end in terms of recruiting rankings. I think it was 4-star on Rivals, 5-star in 24/7. It just hasn't overall looked like that elite can't miss talent. We haven't seen a ton of him, but you don't get the sense that he's the sort of quarterback that Nick Saban sitting there saying, we absolutely need to put Ty Simpson on the field. And Ty Simpson's been here 17 months because he enrolled early. It was part of their bowl practice in December of 2021. Spent all last season, the 2022 season at Alabama, and all this spring. So at some point, if that talent is there, if that can't miss talent is there, you kind of expect it to show up, 17 months in. I'm not sure that it has. But you do see, again, flashes of what Ty can do. You've seen flashes of what Jalen Milroe can do, which I think is more about his legs and his speed and his running ability than it is his arm. And you're just kind of left with where do you go from here? That's really the biggest question coming out of the spring game is what's next.
The guys on the broadcast were saying that Tommy Rees was talking a lot about pocket presence, and you want to see that, the decision-making and the pocket presence. And if you're comparing that to Bryce Young, you are going to lose. Nobody is going to look good compared to Bryce Young when it comes to pocket presence and decision-making. That guy's nimbleness in the pocket to move, never to run, almost never to run, but to move, to keep himself alive, to keep his eyes on target. It's why it's going to be the number one pick in the draft. Shahan and I talk about this a lot on this podcast, like the evolution at programs of guys. And when you go from Jalen Hurts to Tua Tagovailoa to Mac Jones to Bryce Young, to me, it's like, well, how do you get better? I don't know. I guess maybe you could get Caleb Williams to transfer to Alabama tomorrow, like that kind of thing. But I don't even know that that's better. Might be as good as Bryce. Bryce is Bryce. So you have to assume there's going to be a step back. Like Bama has to be prepared. So it's how big of a step back. They were talking the idea that with Bill O'Brien, Mike, former offensive coordinator Bill O'Brien and Bryce Young, that pairing, it's a quarterback-centric offense. Hey, Bryce, make the reads, find the progression, make the throw. We trust you to do everything. With Tommy Rees and these quarterbacks, it may not be as quarterback-centric. Pull back the playbook, lean on your receivers, lean on your running backs. We'll talk about the other skill guys later. Is that going to happen? Will that make this, I don't know what the right word is, not matter quite as much that the quarterback's not Bryce Young if the offense isn't about the quarterback as much as it was the last two seasons?
Yeah, you almost heard Saban telegraphing that a little bit, going back towards last season. I think it was November. He does his weekly radio show. And he was talking, this was before, the season was even over, before Bryce Young was even gone. He was saying that Alabama did a lot of drop back passing with Bryce Young, a lot of quarterback centric stuff, if you will. And he was even saying next year, we'd like to get back to more balance. And when he ever says balance, he kind of, the bells go off because he means the running game.
Yep.
And they didn't have a great running game. I mean, statistically it was there, but there was times when they just couldn't run the ball when they needed to. I don't think Jahmyr Gibbs was like the between the tackles sort of player they could really rely on. He's an explosive, dynamic player outside the tackles and space, but end of the Tennessee game, they needed the first down. They needed to burn some clock and they couldn't run the ball. And they had to get to throwing, and it didn't work. And Tennessee got the ball back, and they won the game. And that, I think, really sticks in Saban's craw when you think of Alabama historically just being able to line up and run and just beat people. And they couldn't really do that last year. But that's also not how college football games are typically won these days. And that's something Saban's talked about for years now, 6 or 7 years, where it's everything's about the quarterback and the passing game and the spread. And, we've gone away from wad ball, as he likes to call it. So they've been ahead of the curve on that. When they had that offense with Tua and Ruggs and Judy and Waddle and Devontae Smith with Mac Jones, like they were the premier passing offense in college football. They were doing what other teams couldn't do. But if you don't have A, the quarterback to do that, or B, the receivers, and I'm not sure they have either, then they're kind of left to try to win a different way. And that's where I think this whole let's go back to the balance and physicality and dominating running game and all of those, sort of themes of this offseason have come up really, again, from last season all the way through this April, where Saban's been talking about it. Offensive linemen have been talking about it, et cetera. And, I think it, like, you're right. It's something that they kind of need to do because that's where they are at quarterback. Can you win that way? Can you win games? Yes, you can win games that way. Can you win a national title that way? It's going to be tough. I think you really have to combine it with a dominating defense. And I know people kind of point to Georgia the last couple of years as maybe not being the most explosive passing team, but they could put points in the board through the air. I mean, Brock Bowers and Darnell Washington and Pickens the year before, like they had players who could really do some damage in the air. Stetson Bennett, was still a productive quarterback. So I don't think you can just simply point to that model as, yeah, you can win a national championship that way. So that's kind of where they're stuck to some extent, is if the quarterback's not good enough and the wide receivers aren't good enough, and they're good, but they're not elite, then you kind of have to lean on the running game. And they do have a guy who they really like, who could become that, Heisman candidate at some point, Justice Haynes, the freshman, 5-star kid, the son of a former NFL running back, Ron Haynes. He's had a great spring, had 3 touchdowns in the spring game. If you can build your offense around him, maybe you got a shot, but even like a Texas offense last year that was built around Bijan Robinson, best running back in the country, didn't really quite have enough juice to win a national title. So it's a tough spot for him.
We're going to talk later about Saban and the idea of Georgia sort of stealing what Alabama does and winning with it, and Saban acknowledging it this week. Actually, maybe Saban could steal something here. You're not going to get a Bryce Young at quarterback. Try to get a Stetson Bennett. Like, get that level of play. Because by the end, Stetson Bennett was winning games for Georgia. Stetson Bennett won the Missouri game for Georgia last year when they needed him to. You don't need to do it all the time. You run the ball. You make nice little easy throws for guys. But you're not going to have Bryce Young. But here's my proposal, Mike. Here, I have the answer. And I know you have a direct line to Nick. You're welcome to pass this along. Play them both. Watching the spring game, it feels like to me the possible answer at quarterback is both. And not, and this is, I'm obsessed with this idea. Doing things from strength, not weakness. So listen, this is not 2 first-round draft picks at quarterback who are ready to go to the NFL right now. But I do think they both, Jalen Milroe and Ty Simpson, both do have strengths. And the thing that I'm, from listening and watching, Mike, just the spring game, you're there all spring. The guys at the broadcast were a little bit like, hey, Ty Simpson looks like he's had a good day. He looks in control. And I was like, is he actually as in control in yours as you're trying to make him out to be? And then Jalen Milroe, they're talking about he's inconsistent. But Jalen Milroe hits a couple sideline shots, nice balls. Yeah, a couple mistakes. I don't think the answer for Bama is a world where Jalen Milroe is not part of the offense. You don't want to throw out the Lamar Jackson name, but I think he's the fastest college quarterback I've ever seen. The 0 to 60, his touchdown run, he shot out of a cannon. It reminds me, not exactly, but a little bit what Ohio State did with Braxton Miller, where Braxton Miller had a good arm and then he was unbelievable running the ball. And you patch that together with some guys around him and you go, and it's not a pro-style passing attack, but man, it can be dangerous. Mike, don't make Jalen Milroe the backup quarterback and be like, well, Ty Simpson makes fewer mistakes. Oh, well, Jalen's number 2. I think that's the wrong answer here, Mike, if they go that way.
Yeah, and I mean, Milroe had the 70-yard touchdown run against Arkansas last year when he came in for Bryce. And if you're running the Milroe offense, it's going to be more quarterback run-based, option runs. They did that a little bit on Saturday. A big hole opens, and you're right. He has the burst. He has the speed to do that. He's one of the best athletes on the team, if not the best athlete. So that's there. And that was there last year, too. I mean, I remember beginning of last year, Saban kind of floating the idea of, let's get Milroe on the field. Special packages, I think, was kind of the term that he used. And it really never happened other than Bryce's injury because it's tough to take Bryce Young off the field. Obviously, now it's different. Let's just hypothetically go down that road. Ty Simpson's your starter. I think it's easier to take Ty Simpson off the field than it would be Bryce Young. I do think the downside of that is not having sort of the alpha, like everybody knowing who the starting quarterback is, having that undisputed leader, flip-flopping back and forth, having every drive, every throw scrutinized by fans of, Ty Simpson threw an incomplete pass. Like, they should put Milroe in there, and the Milroe's in there. He did this. Oh, they should put Ty back in there. And I think, to some extent, Saban went down that road, was it 5 years ago now, with Jalen Hurts and Tua. And that's what spawned the whole after the Louisville game to start that season, when he was yelling at Maria Taylor about, stop asking me about the quarterbacks. And I don't know if he wants to be facing those questions every week of who's your starter, why is this guy playing more than the other one, and not having that certainty, that clear-cut guy. I think there's a downside to that strategy, but Milroe does offer that explosive ability. I do think in Saban's mind, the mistakes from Milroe are overriding that. Even when he was in there last year, he played a little bit against Utah State in the opener, threw an interception. Started against Texas A&M, threw 2 interceptions, I believe, and had 2 fumbles. And then was in there later against Austin Peay for like a drive or two at the end of the year and threw an interception. And that that stuff will really bug Nick Saban if you're making those sort of mistakes and turning the ball over like that. And ball security has been a big thing that Saban's talked about with Milroe. So there's downsides to doing that. And I think the other question that comes to mind there is, would they both be here in Tuscaloosa to be part of a dual quarterback system in September? Because I think in the transfer portal window's open until Saturday, the 30th. And it's open for Alabama to bring quarterbacks in too. Like this may not be the same situation that we're talking about a week from now that we are now, in terms of, does Alabama bring somebody in? And I think the latest name to go into the portal is Notre Dame's
Tyler Buchner.
I'm not a Big Ten guy. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I'm an SEC guy through and through, an SEC guy from Boston, but that's the name that has popped into the portal, and has the connection with Tommy Rees, and was actually offered by Alabama way back in 2018 and coming out of high school in California when Alabama had Steve Sarkisian as its coordinator. And envisioning a scenario where Buchner comes to Alabama and joins the team this summer, maybe has a little bit of a leg up in learning it's Alabama's playbook still, but maybe Tommy Rees has a connection there where that gets up to speed a little bit quicker. Does he have a chance to become the starter? And then again, there's the opportunity for Jalen Milroe or Ty Simpson to transfer. If they don't feel like that shot isn't there for them, that opportunity to start at Alabama isn't there for them. So I'm not so sure the book is closed personnel wise on here are the 2, 3, 4 guys at quarterback for Alabama in September. I don't know if that's the exact same situation as it is right now.
If you think about like what Alabama has done to Notre Dame in the postseason, the idea that like, what's going to happen with Alabama? They're going to take Notre Dame's offensive coordinator and maybe Notre Dame's backup quarterback. Oh, that sounds great. What's happening?
I don't think it's exactly exciting Alabama fans. Yeah, that possibility doesn't seem to be seen as too high. But again, it's one of those where it's not like there's plentiful options. And yes, there's better quarterbacks out there in college football than Jalen Milroe or Ty Simpson. I think the apple of Alabama's eye would have been Drake May at North Carolina, who had committed to them coming out of high school and then changed over to North Carolina when Bryce Young came. But he didn't want to leave North Carolina by all accounts. And then there was the whole thing last week with Miami and Tyler Van Dyke, and they put out that tweet saying he's committed to Miami, and he retweets that. So you don't know exactly what their motivations are, these quarterbacks of staying at particular schools. Obviously Drake May has family connections to North Carolina, but you do have to wonder about the financial aspect of it too, because that's all face the facts. That's how the transfer portal works in 2023. And Alabama, and we've talked about this, I think, before in the podcast, NIL wise, they have money, but they're not number one in terms of money. They can't outbid people necessarily. Like there's a limit there. So if you're talking, you see these numbers thrown around with quarterbacks coming out of high school, like 7 figures, that could be a big ask for Alabama to try to get somebody. And that's, again, the reality of how these things work. So you might have to look a little bit further down, maybe not bargain shopping, but a little bit further down the list. It's like NFL free agency. And that's even what Saban said. It's like a free agent sort of system.
We could do 6 hours on Alabama's quarterbacks and maybe we will. We'll see what happens. But I do want to ask about, is this, so it's Eli Holstein and Dylan Lonergan, right? They're the 2 freshmen who played?
Yep, exactly.
Who is the future of Alabama quarterbacking? Who is Alabama's starting quarterback in 2025? Do people believe that guy is on campus, or are we officially at a stage where Bama's quarterback situation is monstrously in flux, not just now, but down the road? So
I would say to the second part, I think it's true. Yes, it is in flux. I think for every team in college football, it's like a year-to-year situation at quarterback where every single offseason you're going to see tons of quarterbacks move and change teams and go to where the money is and go to where the starting opportunities are. And there's going to be that change every single offseason in college football. That's just how this current system is set up. But if I was working for, a gambling website, shall we say, and I was setting odds on who would be the starting quarterback for Alabama in 2025, I would say it's Julian Saban. Now, he's the 5-star prospect who's coming in as part of this next class for him, the 2024 recruiting class. And he's top 10 sort of prospect in the country at any position. I think number 1 or number 2 quarterback. He's from California. That's the closest that they've been to getting a Bryce Young in terms of recruiting rating since then. And so that's the next guy, and he'll probably be on campus, I would imagine, by December. And then you look at him as potentially having a chance to start as a freshman in 2024. Holstein was fairly highly rated himself. Lonergan was fairly highly rated. They got 2 at the top, I think 12 quarterbacks this year. I think Lonergan looked better out of those 2 in the spring game. And I think Nick Saban even, when he was talking about those 2 guys after the game, made it pretty clear that I think Lonergan had the better game. He also is a baseball player, and at any given moment, theoretically he could go into the baseball draft or get drafted or, whatever his future might be there. And he goes down a different road. And sometimes baseball is better. Like, baseball has all these minor leagues and there's signing bonuses, and, there's potential opportunities there that just don't exist in football. And they might lose him to that. That's always a possibility. But he looked better than Holstein. Now, where does that leave them 6 months from now? I don't know. But again, I think Julian Saban is really the next guy at that position that would have the best shot to start a year or 2 down the road.
Okay, I swear we have to switch positions because we have to give people a view of Bama overall. Short answer on this. Are you surprised that spring is over and we are talking about maybe they'll get Tyler Buckner? That the Bama situation, that it's not settled? Or is this kind of what everybody expected? Or were you guys, you're on the beat, you're talking, did you think, hey, we think there's a decent chance that somebody's going to sort of win the job this spring?
Yeah, I don't know if I knew exactly what to expect. And part of it's because we don't get to watch practice. And so this was really the first time this spring game that we saw these quarterbacks all spring. And for a guy like Ty Simpson, who was their 3rd string guy last year, almost never saw the field. Like, this was really the first substantial time we got to see him play. And so we didn't really know what to expect from that standpoint. I think I've said all along, I would imagine this goes to August. And I think, going into the spring game, walking into the stadium on Saturday, I would have said Jalen Milroe was probably leaning towards, being the starter, or at least being the favorite, because he was leading the first team offense. They divided up, and Milroe had the first team offense and was clearly ahead of Simpson from that standpoint in the coach's eyes. I walked out of the stadium not knowing quite as well, which I think would help Ty Simpson's case to stay. Because if, let's say, Milroe had a really good spring game, and you kind of get the sense, if you're Ty Simpson, that it's just going to be an uphill battle, then I think that increases your odds of leaving. And if he doesn't leave, if he's here after April 30th, then he's stuck here until December because of the transfer portal window rules. He's an undergraduate. He would be here all season. So he kind of has to make the decision now based on only the spring information. He can't go through all of August and say, I want to transfer now. He can't do that. That's the way the rules are set up now. So you kind of have to it forces their hand to make a call. And I think Simpson having the better spring game improves his chances of being in position in August to win the job. How much that means, because there's still 20 practices in August. There's 2 scrimmages. There's a lot more to be settled there, but I don't think we're any closer right now to having an answer than we were 4 weeks ago.
I can understand if Saban's talking about you can't make mistakes. Maybe you don't want your offense to be 100% Jalen Milroe, but man, if this is who it is, I think he's got to be at least 33 or 40% of the offense. The idea that you're going to go with Ty Simpson because he makes fewer mistakes and you have that electricity because he's got an arm and he's got the legs, and yeah, maybe he'll make a mistake. He'll also might win a game for you. I can't imagine you wouldn't want to work that in, but maybe something's going to change. Okay, let's talk about the other parts of this. Offense first. Running back room looks 4 deep. Jace McClellan as an older guy. Justice Haynes, as you mentioned, as a 5-star true freshman. Some other guys in there. Should this be a good, deep, talented Alabama running back room that stacks up there with some of the better running back rooms we've seen there in Tuscaloosa?
Yeah, I'd say among the better. They don't have a Derrick Henry, but, They don't grow on trees. Derrick Henry's don't. So, and honestly, like Najee Harris a couple years ago, I think was better than what they have right now. But it all depends on Justice Haynes. I think the most potential lies in him. Like, I think we know what Jace McClellan and Roydell Williams can do as kind of their 1-2 guys, because they were the primary guys behind Gibbs last year. And there's a few games where the Ole Miss game, second half last November, they ran the ball a lot and they kind of won that game on the ground, just kind of pushing people around. And you can do that. Like, I don't think McClellan's going to break a ton of plays. I really don't think Roydell Williams will. Haynes has that potential. And then Richard Young is actually another 5-star running back to have coming in this summer. And then Jam Miller would be, the current 4th guy, but we'll have to see where Young falls to find out where Miller falls. So, Saban's talked really highly about the running backs. He says as long as they stay healthy, they're fine there. And, they certainly are fine. Are they elite? They're going to have a Heisman Trophy winner at running back? I don't think so, but I think it's better than what they've had, the past 2 years, let's say.
Receiver, you mentioned receiver earlier. They have Jermaine Burton and Ja'Cory Brooks back as the 2 leading receivers from a year ago who are still here. Malik Benson, 5 catches for 70 yards in the spring game, right, as a junior college addition. And then a couple younger guys, Isaiah Bond looked pretty good. Kendrick Law looked pretty good. Burton has a nice catch on a deep ball for almost a touchdown from Ty Simpson. Also had a drop in there, kind of, I don't know. It seems like there's some bodies in there. We're not back to Waddle, Smith, Ruggs kind of territory, but I don't know. It's just a bunch of guys, but it's not that good, or is there some real potential here in the receiver room?
It's a bunch of guys that are good, but not elite. And that's a problem for him. I think it was a problem last year because you had Bryce Young, and statistically at wide receiver, there was just not that one guy who stood up. I think I even did a study, if you will, a tweet study about halfway through the season. I think you go back to the 2020 season, and 6 or 7 games in, Devontae Smith already had like 900 receiving yards. 6 or 7 games in the last year, your best receiver at Alabama had like 300. There was just a difference. You could tell it didn't have that game-breaking go-to. And I remember, like, when I first got here in 2019, I think it was a South Carolina game I covered, and it was Tua over the middle, Henry Ruggs, 10-yard slant, boom, like that, 70-yard touchdown, because Ruggs was so much faster than everybody else on the field. And that happened routinely that season, routinely the next season in 2020 with all those guys that they had. And then, they found Jamison Williams in the portal from Ohio State, and they were able to do that again in 2021. And then they tried to do that in the portal last year with Burton and then Tyler Harrell from Louisville. And Burton, I don't think, has that top level speed to be that sort of guy. And he was good. I think he got better towards the end of the year, but he wasn't explosive, elite. Harrell he had a foot injury in camp and just never really seemed to get on the field. He got on the field late in the season and just was running laps. I mean, he would just run go routes down the field and then jog back, and Bryce Young wouldn't even look at him, and run another go route the next play and jog back and then go to the sideline, and that was it. He would be on the field for 2 or 3 plays. You're watching him from the press box and just kind of laughing about it. And then he went into the portal after the year, has not found a new team yet. So that was a bust. That was a transfer portal addition. That was a big miss by Alabama, and that was a problem for him last year. And they have not added a receiver this year. And so that leaves them with Brooks and Burton, who were the top 2 guys by the end of last year, but again, not elite. And then Benson, who you mentioned, had the 5 catches. Well, 4 of those catches came on the final drive of that spring game, and they were all against a walk-on corner who they were picking on, and then a walk-on safety who they were picking on. And that was the final minute of the fourth quarter. So before that, he only had 1 catch. And, there's been a lot of excitement, a lot of hype about him around Alabama among fans. And, it's certainly possible that he turns into that player, but it's also a big projection going from a junior college to the SEC. And we'll just have to see what happens. I don't know if I'm, putting him all SEC in my preseason ballot quite yet. And then, like you mentioned, Bond and Law. They also have Shaz Preston from last year, who was a freshman. But these freshman classes just haven't come along like they did 5 years ago. When I think the single freshman class, they had Judy and Devontae Smith and then Waddle the next year. And I think Ruggs was in that 2017 class. And you go back 2020, 2021, there were 7 wide receivers Alabama got out of high school. 5 of them are gone through the portal. One of them has like 4 catches in 3 seasons, Tyu Jones-Bell, and the other is Ja'Cory Brooks, who's, again, good but not great. They just recruiting at wide receivers, it's dipped, and they haven't gotten the results that they once did.
Offensive line. It looked like maybe the right tackle had some trouble on Saturday, but then Caden Proctor is there, and he's a 5-star freshman, and he looked good from my vantage point. Do you think Caden Proctor could wind up starting as a true freshman on this offensive line, and overall J.C. Latham at left tackle and some of the other guys that they have? Should this line be good, or is it a question mark?
So overall, I think the line has been a positive of the spring. We've heard a lot of good things about it after really the last 2 seasons. I don't think they were all that great, especially 2 years ago. But so it was really left tackle that struggled in the spring game. It was Elijah Pritchett, who's replacing Tyler Steen, who left. The Vanderbilt transfer came in last year. He's in the draft now. Pritchett was a freshman last year, came in the spring game, gave up 5 sacks by my count on Saturday off the left edge. And then Latham, elite sort of 5-star kid who came in as a freshman 2 years ago, has started at right tackle since last year, has remained at right tackle, which is actually a little bit of a surprise because there's typically an Alabama progression when you go back and look at Jonah Williams and Alex Leatherwood and Evan Neal and all these guys who become first-round picks. They typically start at guard, they go to tackle, right tackle, then they go to left tackle. They're 3 years. Latham, to this point, has stayed at right tackle to start his 3rd year. So, yes, it's possible he moves to the left side in August. We'll have to see what happens there. But you do have Caden Proctor, as you mentioned, who's also an elite 5-star freshman coming in, just a gigantic human, who I think had a better game than Pritchett on Saturday. And I think that is certainly a spot where we could see Proctor start by the fall. And whether it's maybe you move Proctor to the right side and you have Pritchett or Latham on the left side, we'll have to see. But I don't think it was a good game for Pritchett, and that was, from the first-team offensive standpoint, definitely a weak link.
Okay, that's interesting. Proctor, obviously an Iowa kid, was committed to Iowa. Alabama flipped him late. That's a big get. There's a couple of these. There's a third, and we're going to move to defense now. The top 3 freshmen who early enrolled, Caden Proctor, Justice Haynes, and Caleb Downs at safety, all seem to be making an impact. We'll start at the secondary. We know Alabama loses Jordan Battle. We know they lose Brian Branch. We know they lose DeMarco Helms. But Kool-Aid McKinstry and Terrion Arnold at corner might be pretty good. And now you're working in Caleb Downs. And Saban, is Saban saying awesome things about Caleb Downs as a 5-star early enrolled freshman? Could he start in the secondary in the fall, even though the secondary seems like it might be in good shape?
Yeah, definitely a favorite to start. Could be their best player in the secondary if he continues along this trajectory. And even Kevin Steele telling ESPN guys that he doesn't look like a freshman, he looks like a senior. And there's, I think, reasons for that. The bloodlines are really strong with Caleb Downs. His brother, is Josh Downs, who played at North Carolina, is going to get drafted this week. His uncle is Dre Bly, the former NFL corner, who was also coach at North Carolina. So he could have gone to Georgia. He's from Georgia. That was a big recruiting win for Saban over Georgia to get Caleb Downs, who's a top 6 player in this class.
Ohio State really, really wanted Caleb Downs. I think he would have been number 1 on their list of guys in this class that they wanted, and they thought they had a shot. And that was felt in Columbus when Alabama won that battle.
Yeah, and I think if we're sitting here at the end of the year talking about like MVPs of this Alabama team, he could be high on that list. There's certainly a possibility there. But yeah, that's one safety spot. Malachi Moore, who's kind of been their 5th or 6th defensive back his first 3 years, is probably going to move to safety and start at the other spot. That's a strong possibility. And then, corner. You have Kool-Aid McKinstry, who I think has been good. I don't think he's been elite, but he certainly has potential to get there here as a junior. And then the other spot was Terrion Arnold, who started last year and really lost his job to Eli Ricks. The LSU transfer who came in, had a very slow start, eventually started over Arnold. Arnold had some issues with penalties and gave up some plays early in the year. Even when he came back in, when Ricks was hurt late in the year, had some issues. So that's a question mark. We'll have to see how far Arnold has come along. And then, in the 5th defensive back in Alabama system is pretty important. You're always on the field. Right now, it looks like Earl Little with also strong bloodlines. His dad was an NFL safety. is probably their slot guy, the sophomore. So you're looking at, depending on how you look at Arnold, who started last year, but then it finished last year as a starter, 4 new starters in the secondary, which is turnover. It's uncertainty. There's a lack of experience, but not a lack of talent. And especially when we look at Downs, that's kind of the wild card. If he can be that Minka Fitzpatrick type safety, then they're in pretty good shape back there.
Did Little have the pick on Ty Simpson at the 1 yard line?
He did. It was a very good play on his part.
Okay.
A throw, I think Simpson probably could have put a little more juice on, but that was actually 2 plays after Simpson juked Earl Little in the open field on a run. So he got his revenge in that.
Yeah, that was a nice. So that was like the pick that then Alabama gets on the 1 yard line. Then the next throw, Milroe throws the pick down the middle on the ball he shouldn't have thrown. But the Simpson pick was more a good play by the DB there. Losing Will Anderson, who's the biggest impact guy? I guess Dallas Turner and Chris Braswell didn't play in the spring game, right? So we didn't get to see them. We like Jahad Campbell flashed a little bit. I don't know. There's always going to be somebody in the front 7 who's going to be the game-changing, difference-making kind of guy. Is it Dallas Turner?
Yeah, probably Turner or Braswell, and those are both 5-star kids. I mean, Braswell came in Will Anderson's class. They had 3 5-star outside linebackers in the 2020 class. It was Anderson, Drew Sanders, who transferred to Arkansas and is now a second-round pick in the NFL this week, and Braswell, who's kind of hung around behind them, not as much playing time, but now has a chance to become a starter. Turner came into next class as a 5-star kid and has played really well. Maybe not to the level of Anderson, but that's a good duo. And then they have another 5-star who came in the year after, and Jeremiah Alexander, who I think has been a little bit quieter early on, but has potential to play. And then, there's 2 more 5-stars that have coming in at outside linebacker this summer. And Yanze Pierre and Keon Keeley, who they flipped from Notre Dame. And, we haven't seen them yet, but they're going to be sitting there in September with 5-star outside linebackers. I mean, they've recruited the heck out of that position the last 5 years or so. Just outside linebacker upon outside linebacker, because that's where their pass rush comes from. Their defensive linemen, there's usually only 2 of them on the field, and they're just kind of eating up space. And they have Jaheim Otis, who can be an impact player, who's lost 75 pounds, and he still weighs 325 pounds.
Oh!
Because he came into Alabama at 415 pounds as a freshman last year, and played right away because he had lost a bunch of weight over the summer. And he's a good player, but they don't really have that Quinnen Williams type. Like, they've missed that really disruptive defensive lineman who can get up the field. They've had a lot of space eaters that have done a good job, but I don't know if that's where their impact is going to come from. And then at inside linebacker, they've lost both of their starters there, Henry To'oTo'o and Jalen Moody. But they kind of had a guy in Deontay Lawson, who was a pretty highly rated kid 2 years ago, who started working in with Moody. Looked like he was going to become a starter by the end of the year. He's been out this spring. He had a shoulder surgery, so we didn't get to see him. But he's, I'd say, potential to be a pretty important player in the middle of that defense. And like you mentioned, Jahad Campbell is really the other potential starter at inside linebacker. And they did get only 2 transfers this offseason. One of them was an inside linebacker in Tresman Marshall from Georgia, who was, obviously Georgia just has layers of linebackers they've used the last couple of years. He was a bit lower down that list, but also a guy who could get on the field, if not play some special teams for him as well.
Okay. I looked up one more thing that I'm going to throw in here because I forgot to say it before, because I did 10 minutes of research. So then I got to put it on the podcast. I looked at the quarterback run game under Saban. The only 2 times that any quarterback has run the ball 100 times in a season under Nick Saban is the Jalen Hurts years in 16 and 17. He's never used the quarterback run as a part of his offense, really, other than that with Jalen Hurts. And so my suggestion would be do that. I can't get over how special Jalen Milroe seems to be with the ball in his hands. And by the way, Ty Simpson can move too. You have 2 quarterbacks who can move. Go back to that. I don't know about this. Again, this podcast may be obsolete by the time you hear it if they've dropped a gigantic quarterback transfer on top of this competition. But it feels like to me, defense, Justice Haynes, Jace McClellan, some quarterback run game, control the ball. Let's go back in the old Saban playbook. You've reached the peak of passing quarterbacks. I don't know that Nick Saban will ever have. I would guess he won't. That Bryce Young will be the best quarterback to have played at Alabama for Nick Saban by the time he's done. So let's go back to the old days, man, when you weren't worried about that. Who cares if you didn't have a great quarterback who could throw the ball? You won in other ways. So if you don't have Derrick Henry, then use what you have, which is two quarterbacks who seem like they can scoot. One of them who seems elite at it. Have Jalen Hurts come down and give a motivational speech, man. Let's run the quarterback at Alabama this year.
Yeah, that would be the offense, I think, if it was Milroe that they would try to run. It would be the 2016, 2017 offense. But let's keep in mind that had an expiration date. 2017, Jalen Hurts, national championship game. They could not do anything through the air. Nick Saban makes a decision at halftime to bring in Tua because Tua can throw the ball. And they win a national championship game. And starting in 2018, that offense was completely different. And it was like the Big 12, starting with Tua in 2018 and really ever since. So I think Saban kind of reached a realization where if I'm going to win, I'm going to need a quarterback and I'm going to need a passing game. And I still think that's where he falls on this.
Maybe have Jalen Hurts bring his gigantic NFL contract in and be like, are you sure you were right? You moved you benched me at halftime of the national championship game. I had to transfer. Are you sure? Are you sure, Nick? So I understand what you're saying, but also unless Bryce Young walks through the door, maybe a Jalen Hurts style offense isn't such a bad thing. Okay, we're going to take a break. When we come back, I'm going to talk a little bit about the LSU spring game because there's other people out there who played spring games this past Saturday. And then we'll have a final segment with Mike where we talk about Nick Saban's last stand. We'll do all that next on the College Football Survivor Show. The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Doug Lesmerises back. We got to talk a little LSU because the question after watching these two spring games last Saturday is Alabama even the best team in the SEC West? LSU, a lot of people thought looked really good. And you start with the quarterback position, as we just talked about with Mike. Jayden Daniels looks smooth, looks ready, looks in control as a returning starter there. 10 of 11 in that game. And we don't get hung up on stats, but you get hung up on efficiency and explosiveness. And that's what Brian Kelly's talking about after that game. 10 of 11, 168, 2 touchdowns. Brian Kelly liked the quarterback play. And here's why. Garrett Nussmeier is the second guy up at LSU. He is in the same recruiting class as Jalen Milroe. And in that class, he was ranked one spot ahead of Jalen Milroe among the quarterbacks. No, one spot behind. Jalen Milroe was the number 13 quarterback in the class of 2021. Garrett Nussmeier at LSU, the number 14 quarterback. And this is the difference. This is when you have somebody like that in year 3 who might be ready but doesn't have to be ready. Garrett Nussmeier was 5 of 8 for 139, and he was playing with the second team, and Brian Kelly was saying, hey, man, he might have even done some things better than Jayden Daniels because Jayden Daniels had the first team with him. But Garrett Nussmeier looked like maybe he could be ready if he had to be, but he doesn't have to be because Jayden Daniels is back, and Jayden Daniels has a chance to be, as a veteran quarterback at LSU, a Heisman contender. And so at Alabama, you have a third-year guy and a second-year guy, and someone's got a season. At LSU, you have a veteran in Jayden Daniels, the transfer from Arizona State who was there last year, and then you have Garrett Nussmeier, and it just looks so different in the spring when you have this. And it makes me think that this opening weekend game between LSU and Florida State, which we have talked about, Shahan and I have talked about on the show, we're going to talk about, everybody in college football is going to talk about leading up to the season. It's by far the biggest game of opening weekend, and I think it's going to be a version of what we got with Clemson and Georgia 2 years ago. Coming into that game 2 years ago, Clemson was 3, Georgia was 5. Georgia wins and thus begins back-to-back national title runs, and thus begins kind of a sag a little bit from Clemson. That is a line in the sand of who's Bama's primary competition. Well, it had been Clemson in the first 7 years of the playoff era, and then Georgia beat Clemson head-to-head, and away we go. Here we are. LSU, Florida State, is going to be on the Sunday of opening weekend in Orlando. Last year, the Florida State-LSU game was kind of a clown show. Florida State blows a 2-touchdown lead in the final 4 minutes. LSU rallies, but then Florida State blocks the extra point on the last play of the game. So it's not a tie. Florida State hangs on and wins by a point. It's a mess. the game's a mess. And both teams are bringing a lot back, and both teams are not going to be a mess anymore. Both teams showed, I laughed. I made fun of that LSU Florida State game. I think it was week 2 last year, actually. And we are in a different world here. And I think Jayden Daniels for LSU, Jordan Travis for Florida State in that opening weekend, that's 2 veteran quarterbacks. I think both teams have a chance to be ranked in the top 5. They'll both definitely be ranked in the top 10. And it has a chance to set a tone for the season. And the loser's not out. They just have less wiggle room in a 14 playoff era. But there's reason. I've already said it. Listen, last week with Shahan, Florida State had its spring game 2 Saturdays ago. I thought Florida State looked as good as anybody in the country. And I said, coming out of that, Shahan went, whoa. I said, I thought right now, if I'm voting AP preseason, I'm putting Florida State and Michigan as my top 2 teams. LSU's in my top 5. Jayden Daniels looks good. Malik Neighbors, great returning receiver, looks good. And now they have people emerging. Kyron Lacey is one of the stars of that game. 4 for 92, had a 70-yard touchdown on a one-handed catch over the middle, broke a bunch of tackles on the way to the end zone. And it's depth. It's a depth of talent at a position like receiver. And Brian Kelly's talking to the game, hey, we got to push the ball down the field. He liked that both quarterbacks in that game were efficient and pushing the ball down the field because he said, we have so many talented guys. If we don't try to get them the ball down the field and let them make plays, they're going to get frustrated. Kyron Lacey is going to be that complement to Malik Neighbors. Kyron Lacey is 6'2", 212. We're talking about big-time LSU guys who look the part. Brian Collins fills in there. Malik Neighbors, as we said, fills in there. Malik Neighbors is listed at 6 foot, 199. Let's see. Brian Collins, Brian Thomas, excuse me, why am I saying Brian Collins? Brian Thomas, 6'4", 201. If those are your top 3 receivers for LSU, you are in really good shape. Now, running game, I was trying to make a trade when we were doing our mega trades a couple of weeks ago. I'm trying to trade a running back to LSU. They have multiple guys in that room, 4 deep, couple freshmen coming in as well. Brian Kelly says, don't sleep on Noah Cain, the Penn State transfer. He said he was a little choppy last year running the ball. He's smoother now. So keep your eye out for Noah Cain. And he's going to be running behind a super experienced offensive line. They basically bring everybody back from an offensive line that had some issues last year. But with the experience, you can see why they'll get better. And they started 2 true freshmen at tackle last year. 2 true freshmen. Will Campbell at left tackle, according to PFF, in the SEC, among guys who played at least 50% of the snaps for their team, was the 5th highest graded tackle in the SEC as a true freshman. That's unbelievable. Number 36 overall recruit in the class of 2022. And then on the right side, you had Emory Jones. He's the number 110 overall recruit in the class of 2022. They're both back as second-year guys who are second-year starting tackles. A bunch of experienced guys in the middle. So, depth in the running back room, watch out for Noah Cain to emerge. Experienced offensive line with some high elite talent at the tackle spots that were getting their feet wet last year. Imagine how much better they'll be there. Depth of big-bodied, big play receivers, and then 2 quarterbacks. I think Garrett Nussmeier would be ready to start for a bunch of Power 5 contenders right now, but Jayden Daniels is going to be the guy. That's what we're talking about with the LSU offense. This is ready to go. Defensively, they have 8 transfers in there 2 deep on defense, so they are adding. And you can see, you can't just add transfers willy-nilly, but there's a transfer pairing here that I think might be as good as what anybody in the country is doing in terms of bringing somebody in to highlight what you already have. And that is Omar Spates at linebacker. 4-year player at Oregon State, first team all Pac-12 last year, wants to try to win a national championship. He picks LSU. LSU brings him in, and now they're going to pair him at inside linebacker with Harold Perkins, who is one of the most talented defensive players in the country. He's a second-year player, was more on the outside last year about rushing the passer. They're making him more of a linebacker. And you have to look for clues in this stuff. I thought we got a clue from Brian Kelly about Harold Perkins after the game. This is a quote from Brian Kelly's post-spring game news conference. Perkins was really good. And the plays that kind of stand out to me is we ran a counter and he was able to slip the second puller and make a TFL play, a tackle for loss. That requires training, and he's been really good picking those things up. So I think all in all, the development of Harold at the linebacker, the position, and then the addition of Omar, those guys have been really big for us. So this is what we're talking about. Here's the clue. Harold Perkins is talented, but Brian Kelly is picking out a tiny little thing on a read and a technique and make a tackle for loss, not because you're faster than everybody, you're stronger than everybody, because you read the play the right way and you make – watch out. They're taking this guy and they're putting him inside. Watch out. And then you have Omar Spates in there with him, and you have a chance for something here. They brought in a bunch of transfers at corner. Denver Henry among them, former huge recruit. They're going to have a chance to be good in the secondary, in that middle level at linebacker, to be dynamic. And then Ovi Ogofu, who's a transfer from Texas, had been at Notre Dame with Brian Kelly, was at Texas for 2 years, now's at LSU. He's a guy off the edge, didn't have huge stats at Texas, but he could do some things, get in the backfield. He's another guy that Brian Kelly mentioned that showed up this spring. You have playmakers potentially on defense. And again, this is a team that is adding guys. I think they're making big changes. They're making big changes in the transfer portal, but there's a plan to it. Braden Swinson had a tackle for loss in the spring game. He's from Oregon, another guy on the defensive line that has a chance to make an impact. So I think when you talk about the depth that they are bringing back with their own guys on the offensive line, you're talking about some impact transfers to add to a guy like Harold Perkins on the defensive side of the ball, veteran quarterback play, depth of receiver play, big, just watch out. I think this is real. And you don't want to get caught up only in the quarterbacks, but it is hard in spring not to look at the teams that have quarterbacks back and just watch how much more efficiently and smoothly the offense run. And I thought Jayden Daniels looked really good. So compare that to Georgia, and Carson Beck looked good for Georgia, but compare that to what's happening at Alabama, compare that to Ohio State, working in somebody like Kyle McCord, and just what you're getting from Jordan Travis at Florida State, Jayden Daniels at LSU, Michael Penix at Washington, who we'll talk about in a future podcast, Caleb Williams at USC. It's just a different animal. And it matters so much. It's hard not to lean on that. So watch out for LSU. I would put them high on my list. I think we are talking about setting the table for a playoff team with the winner of that Florida State LSU game in week 1 on Sunday. So it's going to be a Sunday. It's like before the NFL starts. So if you're like, go hang out on the Sunday, just still put that on your calendar. Florida State LSU. And Bama's got to be aware of that. LSU, by the way, defending West champ, right? Remember that? Made the SEC title game last year, beat Alabama last year. That's what we're talking about. They're building on something. And so I thought the Brian Kelly move, listen, man, we were kind of laughing at Brian Kelly. And what is he doing? We're laughing at the accent. We're laughing at the dancing videos. And then they looked a little goofy to start last year. But it's happening at LSU. There's a baseline of competence there. And they took some bumps last year, just like Florida State and Mike Norvell took a lot of bumps the last couple of years. But they got it straightened out in the second half of last season, and they have a chance to really do something this year. So keep your eye on LSU. Okay. Wanted to make sure we hit them. Those are the two teams that we're going to talk about on this podcast. So we try to run through spring. We just had to lean into Bama a little bit extra. So when we come back, we're going to wrap it up with Mike Rodak, but it's not going to be as much about the spring as it is going to be about Nick Saban and where he is in his career and what it means for Alabama as a program. We'll do that right after this on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
All right, we're back with Mike Rodak here on the College Football Survivor Show. And Mike, the culture, the vibe of Alabama, it was sort of a passing moment that Nick Saban had in a podcast, but it seems like everybody in college football took note of it. Nick Saban acknowledging that, hey, there's people out there who are kind of doing our thing. And he didn't say the name, but of course he means Georgia. And he said people are having success with it. And he said, we've got to get it back. We just described at the start of this podcast, Mike, well, we don't know about the quarterback. Well, we don't know about the receivers. Well, I don't know. They got to figure out what they're doing with the tackles. Well, the defense should be pretty good, but man, they lost Jordan Battle and Brian Branch and Will Anderson and a bunch of dudes.
But here we are with a Nick Saban team that did not even make the SEC championship game last year. And he is acknowledging, even for him to nod at Georgia, because we all say it. It's like, oh, what's Kirby doing? Kirby's doing the whole young Saban thing. Kirby right now is what Saban was in 8 and 9 at Alabama. Like, he's getting it going. What did you think that meant something? Was that a peek inside Nick Saban's brain? Is this 70-year-old guy saying, oh, y'all like Kirby Smart now, do you? Well, first of all, I taught him everything he knows. And second of all, remember who's the boss. It's me, Nick Saban. Where is Saban first? And we'll talk about what it means for the program. From a personal standpoint, this prideful guy who might be the best head coach in college football history, where do you think he is right now with how he's thinking about his ability to coach and what the world is trying to do to him?
Yeah, it was a really interesting segment of that podcast last week where they had the producer kind of hop in and ask Saban what book he's reading right now. And he mentioned that he likes to read history books, and he was reading a book about kind of how cultures rise and fall over time, civilizations rising and falling. And that kind of, rang a bell in the host of the podcast brain, where he said, well, isn't that kind of like your football team where other people are trying to attack your culture or bring you down, like, civilizations of 2,000 years ago. And that's when Saban kind of made the off the cuff remark of, people have been trying to do that for a while, and somebody's been successful the last couple of years, and we need to take it back. Like, whoa. And yeah, I think as much as like maybe as Saban innocuously just kind of reading a history book and being a history buff, like he's also a guy who doesn't really turn it off. And I would imagine there's some sort of carryover in his brain in between reading that book and kind of getting motivated or trying to understand his current situation, because it's different. This is different than what really where Saban's been since he's been at Alabama, where he's kind of having to go back to being the hunter and instead of the hunted. And, it's hard to deny. I do think there's a little bit of a crisis between certain Alabama fans, because there's some that are still ardent in saying, well, no, Georgia has to prove it over 10 years before they can say that they're the best team now. Like what Alabama did, like they need to win 4 more titles before they can say they're the best. And they've taken over Alabama, which I think it's pretty clear the last couple of years, like Georgia has taken over Alabama as the best team in college football. I think that's hard to deny. But then you have Alabama fans that recognize that, but they say Saban's going to get his revenge. And they go back to that national championship halftime show this year when Saban's on ESPN and David Pollack is talking about Georgia becoming the best team in college football, and the camera kind of pans to Saban just kind of glaring, and people are saying, oh no, they set off Saban, he's gonna go on his revenge tour this year. And I say to that, he was on a revenge tour in 2022 after they lost the 2021 national championship to Georgia, and that fell flat. They lost 2 games last year. They missed the playoffs. He was on a revenge tour in 2019 after they had lost to Clemson in the national championship game and got embarrassed in that game. And they lost 2 games that year, missed the playoffs. So I don't know what the Saban revenge tour looks like, because the last couple of times they've done it, it hasn't looked very good. And it's just kind of reaching the point, too, where the clock is ticking in terms of Saban's career at 72 years old this year. It's a different spot for him. And yeah, I do think it's just small things, too. I mean, it's just their spring game was on like a streaming only broadcast, and ESPN instead was airing Colorado's spring game because Deion Sanders is a better draw apparently than Alabama. Georgia's spring game is on TV because they're defending national championships. Alabama's wasn't. It just kind of that small slippage that's weird to see. And I covered the NFL. I came from New England. You could see it with the Patriots when their dynasty started to slip. It's not this clear drop. Sometimes it's just incrementally you start to lose it. And then look where the Patriots are now. They're probably the 4th best team in that division. Look where Alabama is now. They're not the best team in the SEC. You can make an argument they weren't the 2nd best team in the SEC last year. You can make an argument they weren't the 3rd. And just kind of incrementally kind of falls down a little bit. So look, sitting in the press box on Saturday, watching the spring game, this is the 5th Alabama team that I've covered. Based on that small sample size, this is the worst of those 5 teams that I've covered, the most limited in terms of quarterback and receiver and the elite talent that I've seen going back to 2019. Does that mean they can't win a national championship? No. And if they do, then the paradigm shifts back to Alabama. And how does Saban keep it going? But if they miss the playoff, or let's just say they make the playoff, they don't win a national championship this year, there's going to be questions about Alabama. If they miss the playoff entirely, there's going to be big questions about Alabama by the end of this year. So, yes, I think you can tell just listening to Saban that there's an urgency, to get this back to where it was. And I think a recognition and a realization that it is not where it was. And that's where they are right now. And that's, again, a very strange spot to see them.
It's interesting to hear your take on that, because it's really smart, because a lot of times this always happens when people talk about like, teams' records in big games. It's like, they lose all their big games. It's like, well, they actually won these other big games that you don't remember as big games because they won. And it's, you know what I mean? Like our memories, we forget the things that we don't want to remember. So to me, on the outside, I'm like, hey, before the 2020 season, all I talked about was angry Bama. After what Joe Burrow and LSU did in 2019, I was like, oh my God, angry Bama. And then we saw what happened. Maybe Saban's best team in 2020, just a dominant performance. But it's nice to be angry. It's also nice to have Devontae Smith. It's also nice to have Najee Harris. It's nice to have Patrick Surtain, right? I mean, it's like you can be angry, you can get your back up about things, but then you've got to back it up with talent. You have to have, if you feel like your culture or your program are being threatened, that's a great motivator. I love the idea of Saban being a hunter, not the hunted, but you got to have the right equipment. You can't be out in the, crawling around in the woods, with a slingshot. Right? I mean, what do you have? And so then you look and say, well, who are the weapons? Who does he have to deploy? So I love the idea of Nick Saban, past 70 years old, being like, okay, you want to do this? Do you want to do this? Let's do it. But then you look and say, well, where's Derrick Henry? Where's Devontae Smith? Where's Bryce Young? And it's hard from the outside, Mike, the idea that they had probably the best, most talented offensive player. Caleb Williams would give you an argument, right? But Bryce Young is as good as anybody. And maybe the best, most talented defensive player in Will Anderson, and didn't make the playoff. And now do you have Will Anderson and do you have Bryce Young? That's hard to get past. And I want to watch this. I want to watch sort of angry Nick Saban because I love it. But then we talk about football and you wonder if the horses are there.
And part of it is the transfer portal, which has been, under the current rules 2 years now. And I think when it first started, when everything was loosened up, people were saying the rich get richer. That Alabama, because they added, remember, Jamison Williams and Henry To'oTo'o right away when that opened up. And it was Alabama's just going to collect the best players in the country. And that, I think, was true at the beginning. People thought it was true last year when they go out and get Jahmyr Gibbs, which worked out. They got Tyler Steen, which worked out. But then they got Eli Ricks, which did not work out. They got Tyler Harrell, which did not work out. And they got Jermaine Burton, which sort of kind of worked out. And in the meantime, they're losing volume-wise 3 times, 4 times as many players through the portal. And that's kind of the silent killer for them is, they have – and people will say, well, Alabama's not falling off because look at their recruiting classes. And that's true. They're still number 1 or number 2 pretty much every year. But look where those guys are a year down the road. Look where they are 2 years down the road. They have 5-star, 4-star kids coming in every year, but then they lose 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of them within 2 years. That's kind of been the trend as this has opened up with the portal. There's 14 players that they lost in this winter transfer portal window. They added 2. And again, one of them could be a special teams backup linebacker. So far in this spring portal, they've lost 3. And it's not like, and people look at some of these guys and like, well, he only played 3 games. He was a backup. These are historically the next guys up at Alabama. These are the guys they develop when they're juniors or seniors to become the starters who replace the guys who are going to the draft. And Alabama this year has 13 players going into the draft, 15 really. They could have 13 players drafted. And there's not that second tier, that second wave of players on their roster, that middle class last year, because a lot of those guys came in, they didn't play right away, they got frustrated with their playing time, and they transferred somewhere else. And so now they're trying to replace those guys they lost through the draft with transfers, and they've been very selective in doing that this year, or freshmen. And they could have success in doing that with guys like Downs and Proctor and Haynes, but they may not be successful at other spots. So that's kind of their conundrum, is that train that just kept moving, and you'd have that next player ready to go. Well, that next player now is gone by the time that he's ready to go, because he wants to go someplace else and potentially get paid or potentially play and do something at a different school. And that's happened a lot. And that's really changed the dynamic of how they build their roster every year and how they deal with all the players that they lose to the NFL.
This is one of those things where I think college football is getting what it wanted, which is a greater diversity of teams at the top. We were in this era where early in the playoff era, it was Alabama and Clemson and Ohio State and Oklahoma, and 3 of those 4 were there every year. And people were like, man, this is getting old and stale. What are we doing? And now we have a world where Georgia has come up. And I think what's happening with Ohio State and Michigan in the Big Ten is sort of like a junior version of what's happening with Alabama and Georgia in the SEC, that there was this second team that was always very good but couldn't get past the other team. And now that team has gotten past them. Georgia's gotten past Alabama. Michigan's gotten past Ohio State and won the last 2 Big Ten titles. And for everybody else, it's great. And then Ohio State and Alabama, people are like, what's wrong? How come you aren't doing the same thing you were doing previously? And it's like, well, the world's changed a little bit. And also, other teams are good, and we maybe aren't able to keep it rolling as much. And that's what NIL and the transfer portal is supposed to do. It's supposed to provide more opportunities. But when we zero in, Mike, on teams that have been at the top, looking from the inside out, it's not as fun for those teams, because Alabama fans are saying, hey, we have a standard. And by the way, Saban hasn't finished outside of the top 10 since his first year at Alabama. So like, it's not like they're gone. But when you're talking about who's the best program in college football, you can't dispute it's Georgia right now. When you talk about, is Bama at the very top of national title contenders right now, where they're trying to figure out who their quarterback is. So they're probably not. I thought Florida State looked great. I'd be Florida. If you're telling me who do you want to be for 2023, I'd take Florida State ahead of Alabama right now. Also, Florida State's been in a hole for a decade. So you'd take Alabama's last 10 years, 1,000 to 1 over Florida State. But this is the sport, Mike. And we'll finish with this. This is the sport. This is the culture. This is the reality. The 12-team playoff is going to accentuate this as well, I think. You want more opportunity, because everybody, who weren't Alabama fans, weren't Clemson fans, weren't Ohio State fans, weren't Oklahoma fans, were getting sick of what the playoff had been. But if you are an Alabama fan, man, you loved it. And maybe it's not going to quite be that way anymore.
You can even go the other direction and say Alabama fans might actually grow to enjoy the 12-team playoff, because if they were like last year, the 5th or 6th best team in the college football playoff and they're out, then maybe this provides them an opportunity to be in and to kind of have an opportunity when they wouldn't have otherwise in a 14 playoff, because they've dropped out of that top 4 group of teams. So that could be beneficial to Alabama. But you're right, the entire paradigm of college football shifts with the 12-team playoff. Even with Alabama specifically, there's a shift in what they've done schedule-wise, where you used to have these neutral site bowl games starting every year. Well, they stopped doing that this past year. They go to Texas last year, and they came very close to losing. They had to hit a field goal at the end of that game to win that game. Texas comes to Alabama week 2 this year with Quinn Ewers and Xavier Worthy, who tore up this defense in the first quarter of that game last year before Ewers got hurt. What if Texas comes in week 2 and beats them? Going forward, you have Alabama going to Wisconsin in a future year. You have them going to Tallahassee to play Florida State. Further down the road, there's Ohio State games. There's Notre Dame. Like, it's not a given Alabama just marches through their schedule anymore, because they have potentially every year a road game in September against a high-quality non-conference opponent that they could lose, and it could be totally different the rest of the year if you're talking about a one-loss Alabama team in September, which is something we're not used to at all. So everything's going to shift, and it's going to be different. Again, it might not be a bad thing for Alabama if there is a 12-team playoff, and if they have a loss or 2 losses by the middle of the year, it actually saves them a little bit compared to what was true in years past.
So I love the entire discussion. I think it's fascinating. I don't, at the very least, Saban's not going down without a fight. And maybe the most important name you said on this podcast, Mike, might be Julian Sand. That might be the thing. That just like give like Saban one more year of like maybe Bama not quite being Bama, and let him roll the dice and say, we're rolling with the freshman quarterback in 2024. Watch out. I got my guy again. You think Bryce Young was the peak? Let's do this. Let me give you 3 years of this guy. He might just be waiting for that. But they got to figure out quarterback right now for 2023 first. So Mike Rodak from AL.com, tremendous coverage. If you care about Alabama, and that's the thing I think about stuff like this. Maybe you think you don't care about Alabama, but Alabama affects your team. What Alabama does affects everything in college football. So go read AL.com. It's the best Alabama coverage that you will find. Mike Rodak, we love having you on the show. Thanks so much for making more time for us here on the College Football Survivor Show.
You got it. Thank you.
All right. Thanks to you guys for listening. We'll be back with another round of spring football wrap-ups. We got some good ones lined up for the second show this week. I think we might talk about Deion Sanders and Colorado, even though they only have like 11 guys left on the roster. But we'll work them into our discussion. For now, for Mike Rodak, I'm Doug Lesmerises, and that was the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.